A rusted truck barreled down the rain, slick road. Behind it, 3 tiny shapes dangled in the windbound, bleeding, alive. No one stopped. No one knew. Except for one man, haunted by war, who saw something in those trembling bodies he hadn't seen in years. A reason to fight again. Running for mercy. The mountains of Montana wore the early autumn like a second skimmist coiled through the pine trees, and the wind whispered secrets only the broken could hear. On a forgotten stretch of highway outside Ash Meadow, the silence was pierced not by the cry of an eagle, nor the rumble of distant thunder, but by something far more human, far more cruel. Jack Lawson hadn't meant to drive that way. He was supposed to be at the feed store. Just a quick trip. No talking. No eye contact. The kind of errand a man could do with his hood up and his soul down. But the rain started early, and so did the ache in his chest, that slow, grinding tension that hadn't let up since Kandahar. So he took the back road, the one with no billboards, no radio signal, just trees and memories. That's when he saw it. A battered, blue pickup swaying through puddles like it had too much to drink. And behind it, something moved. 3 somethings, small, struggling. At first, Jack thought it was debris, maybe trash or rope. But then, one of them twitched. And then, it screamed. A sound no living thing should ever make. High, sharp, broken. He slammed on the brakes. Ash Meadow, Montana, was the kind of town you missed if you blinked twice on the highway. Tucked between 2 mountain ridges and flanked by endless rows of pine trees, it was quiet, remote, and soaked in the damp chill of early October. Rain had swept through the night, leaving the roads slick and the air laced with the scent of wet bark and cold stone. Fog hovered low, curling around the tops of fence posts like ghosts reluctant to leave. Jack Lawson drove alone down Route 86, a desolate stretch of 2-lane asphalt known more for elk crossings than human traffic. His truck, an old but loyal Dodge Ram, rumbled steadily beneath him, wipers creaking with each sweep. Jack 38, tall, broad-shouldered, a man carved by war and solitude, kept his eyes on the road but his thoughts miles away. His dark hair had begun to show gray at the temples, and his beard, unkempt but clean, framed a face that rarely smiled anymore. Years in the Air Force Rescue Wing had taught him to survive the impossible, but no one had trained him for silence after service. He had planned a simple day, restock supplies, fill the propane tank, maybe pick up coffee from Martha's Diner if he felt sociable, which he never did. But then, just past mile marker 24, he saw it. A battered blue pickup truck groaned along ahead, its tailgate half open, an old wooden panel bouncing loosely behind. At first glance, it looked like a poorly secured load. But as Jack narrowed his eyes, something shifted in his chest. There, swaying violently in the wind, were 3 small shapes bound to the wooden plank by what looked like rope or wire. And they were moving. A bump in the road sent the entire panel jolting, and one of the shapes let out a shrill, broken yelp, the kind that claws through bone and goes straight to the soul. Jack's breath caught. Without a thought, he pressed the gas. He caught up to the truck within seconds. The license plate was barely readable, caked in mud and rust. The vehicle itself was a 1990s model Chevy Silverado, its frame sagging under age and neglect. Jack flashed his high beams once, then again. No reaction. The truck swerved slightly, but it kept going. Jack honked. Still, nothing. He pulled to the left and drew level, waving hard through the rain-streaked glass. The driver finally glanced over a wiry old man with sun-leathered skin and a cigarette hanging from the corner of his mouth. Jack gestured frantically toward the back. The man frowned, slowed down, and turned onto the gravel shoulder. Jack pulled in behind him and jumped out before the trucks had fully stopped. The moment his boots hit the wet gravel, Jack ran to the rear of the Chevy. What he saw made his stomach lurch. 3 German Shepherd puppies, no more than 7 weeks old, were dangling by their necks from the crude wooden plank. The ropes were frayed, cutting into their tiny bodies. Their legs scraped the ground with each bounce. One had blood on its mouth. Another had already stopped moving. Only the third, a small black pup with alert eyes and trembling limbs, was still trying to twist free. Jack didn't think he moved. He pulled out the folding knife he always carried and began cutting the ropes as fast as his hands would allow. The black pup dropped into his arms, panting, eyes wide with panic. The second, a golden-colored female with matted fur and a slight wheeze, followed. The third one, a gray pup with a white stripe on its head, was limp but breathing. Jack placed all 3 carefully onto the back seat of his own truck, wrapping them in the old army blanket he kept for emergencies. Behind him, the driver finally emerged. He was in his late 60s, maybe early 70s, gaunt and wiry with a crooked nose and grease-stained hands. His name, Jack would later find out, was Earl Drummond, retired mechanic, known around town for his foul temper and dirt-cheap dogs. Earl squinted at Jack. "What the hell do you think you're doing, boy?" Jack turned, jaw tight. "They were being dragged, tied up like meat. What's wrong with you?" Earl shrugged. "Wasn't dragging, just keeping 'em still. Damn things won't stay in a crate. They're no good anyway. Cowards. One bit me." "They're puppies, you bastard," Jack growled, stepping closer. "You left them to die." Earl spat in the dirt. "Ain't your business." Jack didn't respond with words. He stepped forward and stared the man down, eyes steady, military calm radiating off him like storm clouds. Earl hesitated, then scoffed and turned back toward his truck. "Do what you want. They're worthless." Jack stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, fists clenched. He watched the man drive off in a trail of dust and moral rot. Then he climbed back into his own truck, the heater already humming. He looked in the rearview mirror. The pups were silent now, huddled together under the blanket, shaking. He didn't know their names, didn't know where they'd come from or why someone like Earl had them. But he knew one thing: they would not spend another night like that. Not while he was alive. The rain had tapered into a steady mist by the time Jack Lawson pulled his truck into the gravel driveway that wound toward the old hunting cabin tucked beneath a cluster of towering firs. The fog clung low to the earth, shrouding the forest floor like a blanket, trying to conceal the scars left behind. The cabin, weather-beaten but solid, stood, as it had for decadesolate, still, and surrounded by wilderness. Jack cut the engine and sat still for a moment, the heater humming, his hands wrapped tight around the steering wheel. Behind him, the 3 puppies were huddled beneath the army blanket, their small bodies trembling in silence. The black one, the fiercest of the trio, had his eyes open, watching Jack through the mirror. The golden one had begun to whimper again, a high, broken sound that scratched at Jack's already fraying nerves, and the gray pup with the white stripey hadn't moved since they left the roadside. Jack stepped out of the truck and opened the rear door slowly. "Easy," he murmured, reaching in to scoop the pups one by one into his arms. The black pup tried to resist, but the strength wasn't there. Jack cradled all 3 against his chest as he trudged through the mud-slick path to the front porch. Each step was measured, careful, as though he was carrying something fragile enough to break from sound alone. Inside, the cabin still smelled faintly of smoke and old pine leftovers from the last fire Jack had built weeks ago. He set the pups down gently on a wool blanket spread out beside the fireplace. He hadn't lit it in days, but now he knelt and struck a match with steady hands. Flames rose quickly, licking at the dry wood with hunger. The warmth would take time, but it was a beginning. He moved next to the pups, examining them in the flickering firelight. The golden one had a gash near her ear, raw and red. The black one had bleeding pads on his paws, likely from scraping the pavement. But it was the gray pup who worried him most. His breathing was shallow, eyelids fluttering, and his limbs limp. Jack stood and moved to the kitchen, if it could be called that. The cabin was basic. One room, a wood stove, a table, and a sink connected to a gravity-fed water line. He opened a cabinet and pulled out a first aid kit, dusty but intact, and then grabbed a few cans of Spam and a jar of peanut butter. It wasn't dog food, but it was all he had. As he worked, the sound of tires crunching on gravel broke the silence outside. Jack froze. He reached under the table and pulled out the revolver, tucked into an old canvas holster habit, not fear. Peering through the dusty window, he saw a familiar old Ford Bronco come to a stop in front of the cabin. A woman stepped out tall, wiry, with graying auburn hair pulled into a tight braid. She wore a ranger's jacket and a look of practiced calm. Margaret Hale, 52, had been a park ranger in the region for almost 30 years. She was known around Ash Meadow as firm but fair, the kind of woman who could hike 10 miles in snow without complaint and still fix a broken radio with duct tape and grit. Her late husband, also a ranger, had died in a wildfire 10 years ago. Since then, Margaret had become sharper, harder, but beneath it all, there was still a softness she kept hidden, like a wound she'd chosen not to treat. She knocked once and let herself in. "I saw your truck on the pass," she said. "Didn't expect you to be back out this way. Thought you were still down south." Jack set the revolver down and nodded. "Changed plans." Margaret looked past him and saw the pups. She stepped forward slowly, her voice lowering. "What happened?" Jack told her, sparing no detail. The highway, the truck, the ropes, the man. She listened in silence, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "That sounds like Earl Drummond's truck," she said. "He's been reported before. Never enough evidence to charge him. Bastard sells litters cheap to logging camps and backyard breeders. Doesn't believe in vets or food if it costs more than $1. Jack's jaw tightened. These ones wouldn't have made it another hour. Margaret crouched beside the gray pup and gently touched its side. "This one's fading fast. He needs real help." Jack hesitated. "There's a vet in town, right?" "Yeah, Dr. Rachel Granger. She just moved here from Helena. Young, smart, doesn't ask too many questions." Jack nodded once, decisively. "Then let's go." 15 minutes later, Jack was speeding down the road toward Ash Meadows Town Center, the gray pup wrapped in a towel on the passenger seat. The others had been left behind in Margaret's care. She had built kennels behind her barn for rescue wildlife and promised to keep them warm. The clinic was a modest brick building with a wooden sign that read Ash Meadow Veterinary Services. Jack pulled up and carried the pup inside. Dr. Rachel Granger was in her early 30s, blonde with short-cropped hair and soft eyes hidden behind rectangular glasses. She was petite, almost too small for the white coat she wore, but there was a quiet confidence in the way she moved. Born in Michigan, she'd relocated to Montana after a messy divorce and had found comfort in small towns and silent woods. Rachel looked up from her chart and froze for half a second when she saw the bleeding bundle in Jack's arms. "Set him here," she said, pointing to the exam table. Jack obeyed. "What happened?" she asked. "Rescue," he said simply. Rachel didn't ask further. She moved quickly, checking pulse, temperature, eyes. "Severe dehydration. Blood sugars low. Might be internal bleeding. We'll need to stabilize before anything else." She inserted an IV with skillful hands. Jack watched in silence, his chest tight, his hands clenched. An hour passed, then 2. Finally, Rachel came out from the back room where the pup lay on a heating pad. "He's not out of the woods," she said, "but he's a fighter." Jack nodded once. "Good." Rachel studied him for a moment. "Most people wouldn't have stopped." "I'm not most people," he replied. That night, Jack returned to the cabin under a sky riddled with stars. The 2 remaining pups stirred as he stepped inside. He knelt between them, and for the first time in weeks, whispered something like a prayer. "You made it. One's still fighting. That's enough for today." The nights in Ash Meadow had a way of pressing down on you. They weren't loud, but they weren't quiet either. There were sounds the groan of tree limbs, the rustle of distant animals, the steady whisper of wind moving through pines, but they were the kind that filled the gaps in your thoughts, not eased them. Jack Lawson hadn't slept much since bringing the puppies back to the cabin. He hadn't really expected to. The war had trained his body to function on fractured rest, on adrenaline and instinct. But this was different. This wasn't the battlefield. This was something quieter and somehow heavier. He had returned from the vet clinic hours ago. The gray pup, now resting in a small heated box Margaret lent him, had begun to stir weakly. Rachel Granger had warned him the next 48 hours were critical. Jack had watched the small rise and fall of the pup's chest like a man watching the last light on a dying beacon. The remaining two were not much better. The black one, Jack, had started calling him Blitz, after an old canine dog he'd once worked with overseas would bark at nothing and occasionally throw himself against the wall when startled. The golden one, Honey, because of the color of her fur and the way her eyes looked soft, even through the pain, was the most broken. She trembled when touched, flinched at movement, and refused food unless it came from Jack's fingers directly. Jack wasn't good with dogs. He'd grown up without pets and hadn't thought about owning one since coming back to Montana. But he knew pain. He knew what it did to the body, to the mind. And more importantly, he knew what silence could do if it stayed too long. That evening, after gathering dry kindling and lighting another fire, he sat cross-legged near the pups and began speaking. Not loudly. Just enough that his voice filled the space between the crackling wood and the wind outside. He told them things he hadn't told Anya Nenot Margaret, not the VA counselor in Bozeman, not even his dead father when he used to talk to the walls of this very cabin. He talked about his last tour, about the explosion in Ghazni that took his friend Corporal Dean Madsen, a wiry redhead from Ohio with a crooked smile and a gift for bad jokes. He told them about how he couldn't hear properly for 3 weeks afterward, how even now loud noises made his heart skip. He told them about the survivor's guilt, the long hospital stays, the months of physical therapy where no one said it, but everyone knew some wounds were never meant to close. Blitz stared at him the whole time, head tilted slightly, as if trying to understand. Honey remained curled tight, eyes half-lidded. Jack didn't know if they understood, but he kept speaking anyway. And when he was done, he offered them food-softened canned chicken and warm broth. He fed them slowly, spoon by spoon, hand by hand. That night, he tried to sleep on the couch, wrapped in a flannel blanket, body half listening for whimpers. Around 2 a.m., the whimpers came soft and sharp, like someone crying into a pillow. Jack sat up and found Honey in the corner, scratching at the wall, her body trembling so hard it looked like she might split in two. Blitz stood nearby, growling low, not at her but at the memory he couldn't shake. Jack got up, walked slowly toward Honey, crouched down and reached out a hand. "It's okay," he said softly. "No one's going to hurt you. Not here." At first, she shrank. Then, after several long seconds, she pressed herself against his hand, not out of affection, but out of exhaustion. Jack scooped her up, blanket and all, and brought her to the couch. He laid back, and she curled up at his feet, resting her head on his ankle. He stayed still for hours, and for the first time since she arrived, Honey didn't cry in her sleep. The next day, Margaret stopped by with a bag of supplies puppy pads, basic food, a chew toy that looked like it had fought a bear and lost. She also brought Jack's mail, something he hadn't collected in over 2 weeks. Among the stack was a yellow envelope marked from Montana Wildlife Services and a small note in cursive handwriting. "It's from Sheriff Harlan Boone," Margaret said. "He heard about what happened with Earl." Jack raised a brow. "He's still sheriff?" "Since before you left for the military. Stubborn man. Wears the same hat he wore 20 years ago. You'll like him." Jack opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from Boone, a former Marine with a handshake like iron and a deep baritone that made everyone listen. He confirmed reports had been made about Earl Drummond's past behavior, but never enough to stick. Now that Jack had witnessed the cruelty firsthand, Boone encouraged him to give a statement. Jack folded the letter and set it aside. He'd deal with that later. For now, his focus was the pups. That night, Jack set a name for the gray pup, as well the one recovering slowly from the brink of death. The white stripe on his head reminded Jack of a military chevron, sharp, distinct. A mark of someone who earned their place. He named him Scout. Blitz, Honey, and Scout. Each one carried scars Jack couldn't see, but he recognized the way they moved. The flinches, the silence, the way they curled away from warmth like they didn't deserve it. He recognized all of it because he had lived it. The early morning sun filtered through the fir trees with a reluctant warmth, casting long, golden beams across the moss-damp earth outside Jack Lawson's cabin. Inside, the fireplace had gone cold, but the room no longer felt empty. Blitz, now healthier and bolder, sat at attention near the front door. Honey, ever cautious, rested her head on Jack's foot as he drank black coffee from a chipped green mug. Scout, the youngest and smallest, was curled in an old laundry basket padded with a wool sweater. His breathing had evened out, but his ribs still showed through his thin coat like shadows beneath snow. Jack hadn't planned on taking them back to the vet so soon, but something in Scout's eyes this morning, dull, glassy, distant, told him the pup needed another look. So he loaded all three into the truck and headed into town. Ash Meadows' main street was barely a mile long, lined with rustic shops, faded banners, and townsfolk who greeted you with a nod, but not a question. Jack parked outside the vet clinic, the familiar wooden sign creaking in the wind. Inside, Dr. Rachel Granger was already waiting. Her white coat was wrinkled from a long shift, her blonde hair pulled back into a tight ponytail. She gave Jack a tired smile as he walked in with the pups. "Back so soon?" she asked. Scout's breathing changed again, Jack said simply. Rachel knelt beside the laundry basket, lifting the pup with gentle hands. "I'll take a look. You can wait in the exam room." Jack nodded, sat in the corner chair, and placed Blitz and Honey beside him. The two dogs seemed more relaxed than before. Honey even pressed lightly against his leg instead of curling away. Minutes later, the front door opened with the creak of old hinges. A heavy pair of boots stomped across the linoleum, followed by a voice that hadn't aged a day in Jack's memory. "Well, I'll be damned, if it ain't Jack Lawson." Jack turned. Sheriff Harlan Boone, late 50s, barrel-chested and slow-moving like a bear just out of hibernation, stood in the doorway. His tan uniform stretched slightly at the belly, his Stetson perched at a cocky angle. A man who'd served in the Gulf War before turning to small-town law enforcement, Boone had a reputation for speaking only when it mattered. "Didn't expect to see you around," Boone said, eyes falling on the pups. "Or them." Jack stood and shook his hand. "Wasn't part of the plan." Boone glanced at Blitz, who eyed him back like a sentry. "That one's got fire. And nerves. You know what kind of litter they come from?" Jack shook his head slowly. Boone reached into his coat and pulled out a weathered folder. He handed it over. "Found this in a report from State Wildlife Enforcement. Someone flagged Earl Drummond last month. Said he was trafficking animals with unlicensed breeders. When I heard about your rescue, I dug deeper." The folder was thin but heavy with implication. Inside were registration forms, emails, photos, and a stamped letterhead. Canine Tactical Training Program, Missoula Division. Jack scanned the paperwork, his jaw tightening. "These dogs," Boone said, nodding toward the pups, "were part of a specialized canine litter, bred for law enforcement contracts. Problem is, someone flagged them, early said they were too emotionally unstable, overly sensitive, couldn't adapt to discipline." Jack looked up. "So they were discarded?" Boone nodded. "The breeder on record? Name's Colton Merrick. Used to run dogs for Customs and Border Patrol out of Nevada. Got a clean record on paper, but I've heard things. Pushed litters too young. Abused failures. Found a loophole when funding drop sells them under the table, sometimes to people like Drummond." "Like equipment," Jack said flatly. "Broken gear gets tossed." Boone let out a slow breath. Exactly. We've tried to go after him before, but Merrick's careful. Hires go-betweens, moves states every few months. Paper trails vanish. Dogs vanish. Jack stared down at the pups. Blitz stared back, unblinking, as if he knew. You said this litter was flagged for being too emotional? Jack asked. Yup. The term used was reactive sensitivity. Basically, they didn't respond well to traditional training. They weren't aggressive, they just froze. Shut down. Jack remembered the way Honey had trembled that first night. The way Scout had whimpered in his sleep. The way Blitz, even now, never stopped watching him for cues. Boone clapped a hand on his shoulder. They're lucky you found him. I'm not letting them go, Jack said, voice low. Not back to any program. Not to anyone. Boone nodded. Didn't figure you would. Rachel returned a moment later, her face unreadable. Scout's stabilizing. No fever. I'll keep him overnight, just to be safe. Jack exhaled. Thanks. Boone tipped his hat. Let me know if you hear from anyone asking about them. Merrick's not the type to let a trained litter disappear quietly. Outside, the air had turned colder. Jack looked up at the sky, gray clouds bunching like fists overhead. He loaded Blitz and Honey into the truck. Scout would stay safe in Rachel's clinic, for now. On the way home, Jack stopped at the feed store. He picked up a large bag of kibble, a metal water bowl, and a nylon leash. The clerk, a lean man in his 30s named Ray Dobbins, had messy brown hair and a tattoo of a hawk on his neck. Ray had grown up in Ash Meadow, always quick with a grin and slow with judgment. He didn't ask questions, just rang Jack up and threw in a rubber chew bone for free. Jack returned to the cabin, the sky now spitting sleet. He lit the fire, laid out blankets, and fed Honey and Blitz. After they settled, he sat beside them, folder still in his lap. Colton Merrick. That was the name now branded in Jack's mind. Whoever that man Wash had written these pups off. But Jack hadn't. Not then. Not now. Not ever. Rain fell in heavy sheets over Ash Meadow, drumming against the rooftop of Jack Lawson's cabin like the persistent tapping of fate. The sky was a vast canvas of thunderclouds, rolling low and dark over the pines. A chill clung to the air, not just from the weather, but from something else. Blitz stood near the front door, shoulders square, ears forward. Scout, leaner but stronger now, crouched slightly ahead of the threshold, body tense. Honey, still the smallest of the three, hovered behind Jack's legs, not trembling this time, but quiet, alert. It was almost midnight when the truck pulled up. Jack didn't need to see the man's face to know who it was. He recognized the sound of that misaligned engine, the rusted hinges, the idle hum of something both broken and mean. He stepped forward slowly, placing a hand on Scout's back. The man who got out was shorter than Jack remembered. Earl Drummond looked older, his face more sunken, his gait stiffer, his left eye shadowed with something purple and fresh. He wore a stained canvas coat, boots caked with dried mud, and a smugness that didn't match the storm behind him. In his hand, he held a damp manila envelope. Jack didn't speak. You took what wasn't yours, Earl said, voice cutting through the rain. I'm here to fix that. Jack's voice was calm, cold. You're not fixing anything. Earl smirked and held out the envelope. These say otherwise. Breeder's documents. Ownership papers. Those dogs, those canine rejects, belong to me. Behind Jack, Blitz released a low growl. Scout took a step forward. Honey moved closer to Jack, but her tail no longer tucked. They're not dogs to you, Jack said. They were cargo. Disposable. You left them to die. They're mine, Earl snapped. And I've got the papers to prove it. The screen door creaked open behind Jack. Sheriff Harlan Boone stepped into view, broad and deliberate, rain beating on the brim of his hat. In one hand, he held a sealed documenta warrant, signed just hours before. You've got some paperwork, Drummond, Boone said. But I've got a statement from a federal inspector, a vet report, and 3 witness testimonies that say otherwise. Earl's mouth twitched. You siding with him? Boone didn't blink. I'm siding with the law, and the law says you're done. As Boone stepped closer, Blitz let out a sharp bark short, commanding, enough to make Earl flinch. Scout moved into position, between Jack and Earl. The message was clear. Boone slapped the warrant into Earl's chest. You're under arrest for animal cruelty, falsifying ownership documents, and obstruction of an ongoing investigation. You think you've won something? Earl hissed. They're damaged goods. They ain't worth. Jack stepped forward. They're not property. They're family. Earl's words died in his throat. Boone took him by the arm and guided him back to the truck. The door slammed. Taillights vanished into the storm. And just like that, it was over. 3 months passed. Winter came early that year, blanketing Ash Meadow in snow before Thanksgiving. The town slowed to a quiet hum. The cabin became a Havana place of warmth and routine. The days stretched longer, the nights less restless. Honey was the first to leave. A week after the trial, Mrs. Nora Whitman, a 72-year-old widow with silver hair and hands like worn leather, visited the clinic. Nora had lost her husband, Arthur, 2 years prior to a stroke. She lived in a little farmhouse outside town, surrounded by memories and silence. Rachel suggested Honey as a companion. The moment Nora walked into the room, Honey approached her gently and laid her head in the old woman's lap. Nora cried, and Honey didn't flinch. The adoption was finalized 2 days later. Jack watched from the porch as the 2 of them disappeared down the snowy road, 2 quiet hearts finding each other. Scout's path came next. Rachel had mentioned a veterans' PTSD center in Bozeman. They were piloting a therapy dog program and looking for candidates. Jack wasn't sure at first, but Scout had a gift. He sensed emotion, reacted not just to noise, but to energy. He could calm a child in distress with a single nuzzle. After a 2-week evaluation, Scout was approved. Jack drove him up the mountain road himself. The goodbye was quiet, but full of pride. Scout didn't look back when he left, and Jack didn't need him to. He knew. That left Blitz. The black-coated shepherd had never strayed far from Jack. He was always near Weather beside the woodpile, pacing the porch, or lying at Jack's feet while he fixed the old fishing net in the barn. He followed Jack on morning runs, matching his pace, eyes scanning the tree line like a soldier on patrol. Jack didn't offer him to anyone. He didn't have to. They belonged to each other. On the first clear morning in January, the snow had settled in soft waves across the valley. Jack stood at the top of the ridge behind the cabin, breathing in the sharp, pine-scented air. Blitz sat beside him, tail still, eyes alert. The sun crested the horizon, casting golden light over the white expanse. Jack looked down at the footprints in the snow 2 sets. 1 human, 1 canine. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from anything. He was running toward something.